What if Cypress Hill were a straight edge hardcore band? That's the admittedly ridiculous question we'll be trying to answer on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was I Wanna Get High by Cypress Hill, and I attempted to turn that into an early 80s style straight edge hardcore punk song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Like probably anyone else around my age who was approximately alternative as a teenager at that point in the 90s, I was pretty into Cypress Hill back in the day, in spite of the fact that I was never in any respect a stoner, not for want of trying. I absolutely grew up believing all the idiotic rock and roll myths and was completely convinced that when I finally got to try weed it was going to change my life and it's going to be fantastic. And then when I finally managed to actually try it in my mid-teens, as it turns out, it's just not for me at all. Just made me feel really nauseous. Tried that a few times, desperately wanted to seem cool, just wasn't happening at all, so had a very short-lived dalliance with pop. But in spite of that, I still really enjoyed Cypress Hill. Just something about the sound of those, particularly the first couple of records, that sort of bass-heavy beats with these really cool, dirty-sounding samples plucked from all kinds of really interesting places. And then the contrasting voices of Be Real and Sendog spinning out these outrageous tales of violence over the top. It was a pretty intoxicating mixture, especially for an impressionable teen living a very mundane, rural Northern English life. So the group was initially formed back in 1988 in Los Angeles. Originally it was a four-piece group under the name of DVX for Devastating Vocal Excellence, and that featured Mellow Ace, who I think is Sendog's brother. Mellow Ace didn't stick around for very long, so pretty soon, within the year, they became a three-piece with Sendog and Be Real rapping and DJ Muggs producing and manning the turntables, and that's obviously the beginning of Cypress Hill, as they were renamed shortly afterwards. And those first two albums, the self-titled debut and then Black Sunday, for me, that's some of the best sounding hip-hop of that era. DJ Muggs' production, it's so gritty, so bassy, sample heavy like the Bomb Squad's production, but instead of being up-tempo and driving and aggressive, it's generally slower and more menacing and eerie, drawing samples from a really eclectic range of places, from Black Sabbath to jazz records to old blues records, influences coming from all over the place. And then topped off with these two really contrasting vocal styles. Be Real with the super nasal, almost cartoonish delivery, which contrasts really sharply with Sendog's kind of aggressive bark that he's got. And those records totally shaped at least one strand of hip-hop going forward into the 90s. I don't think they could really maintain that exact sound for too long because, like everyone else in hip-hop, they were really hit by legal changes regarding the use of sampling, which, was good news for all the artists who were being sampled, but bad news for all the hip-hop producers who were building these incredible sound collages out of just bits and bobs of other people's records. So, like with RZA from the Wu-Tang Clan between the first and second Wu-Tang albums, you do get a really marked change in production style between the second and third Cypress Hill records. And I think a lot of that comes down to wanting to back away from that more sample-heavy style. And they've definitely done some cool stuff since, but it's never been quite the same for me. A lot of the rest of the 1990s was spent leaning a bit more into rock. I guess started off with their appearances on the Judgment Night soundtrack, which is a landmark hip-hop rock crossover project. Their contributions were there's a song with Pearl Jam and also a song with Sonic Youth. As the 90s go on, they lean more into this rock crossover style. They definitely get co-opted by the new metal scene that's emerging, which I'm sure commercially was very good news for them. Maybe not artistically quite so good news, but as well as touring with other hip-hop acts, they're touring with rock bands, featuring on Lollapalooza as documented in the brilliant Simpsons Homerpalooza episode. So there's some interesting stuff later on in their career, but nothing that has ever stood out to me as being particularly essential. I was amused to note that last year they finally ended up performing with the London Symphony Orchestra, which is just a hilarious throwback to that Simpsons episode I mentioned where they're backstage at the festival and the stage manager comes in and announces that, "Excuse me, did anyone order a London Symphony Orchestra? Possibly while high. Cypress Hill, I'm looking at you." And they decide that they can't actually remember whether they did or not, but they assume they must do. So then you get this hilarious orchestral rendition of Insane in the Brain. And it turns out I think it was actually Peter Frampton who'd ordered the London Symphony Orchestra. But yeah, they actually made that a reality last year, which is really cool. And they've had their ups and downs. I think at one point Sendog left for a bit. I know DJ Muggs went on hiatus for a while and has kind of just been coming back sporadically. He's not been a full-time member of the group, and I believe they're planning to come together as a full ensemble again to make their 11th and final album quite soon, so we'll see how that pans out. But as I say, there's a lot more music there than I've ever really properly investigated, but those first couple of albums are pretty essential hip-hop of that era, and as representatives of the Latin community in hip-hop music, they definitely deserve their place in the Hall of Fame there. But yeah, obviously the main thing that everyone knows about Cypress Hill whenever their name is brought up is their love of marijuana. It's been a central theme of their work throughout their career. They were enthusiastic campaigners for the legalization of cannabis, and they succeeded in California at least, definitely. So, I mean, you could certainly argue that their work was probably influential in putting that issue in the mind of a whole generation of people, eventually leading up to the actual legalization. So as performers, I guess that makes them about as far from straight edge as you could possibly be. If you're not familiar with the term straight edge, I assume most people are, but there's possibly some people who aren't. A straight edge is a movement within hardcore punk that advocates for a clean living lifestyle, abstaining from alcohol and drugs and tobacco. It takes its name from a song by the band Minor Threat, so you can see Minor Threat as the fathers of straight edge, but really its roots go back earlier, and also Minor Threat never intended for the song to spark a movement. They never intended to be part of a movement. So it's kind of an interesting thing how it grew up, really. Really, I guess the beginning of straight edge is in the infancy of the Washington, D.C. hardcore scene. A lot of the first hardcore punk bands that started there in the wake of the groundbreaking work of the Bad Brains, who were most emphatically not straight edge, a lot of the bands who formed after them were really young kids, mostly kind of suburban white kids who'd grown up listening to Ted Nugent until Bad Brains kind of blew the roof off their world. And Ted Nugent famously is outspokenly anti-drugs, so they probably had a little bit of that kind of attitude already subliminally implanted there by the Nuge. But then these young kids are starting to play in punk bands, they're starting to get out and play in the local scene. There's already an existing DC punk scene of a bunch of older guys who are very much still into the rock and roll thing. They're drinking, they're probably doing some drugs, and they're a bit disdainful of this new generation of kids who are trying to get into the music. They're mocking them, they're belittling them. So kind of as a reaction against this sort of old guard of original Generation 1 DC punks, the new bands make it a point of pride that they're not going to be into that rock and roll nonsense. We don't need that. We don't want to be like you old has-beens anyway. So at this stage, it's not really any kind of strict movement about purity of lifestyle or anything. It's more some teenagers thumbing their nose at older people who have been looking down on them. And a bit of the vital iconography of the early proto-straight edge movement comes in soon soon after, because these bands with kids in, the Teen Idols, the Untouchables, are getting out and trying to play in clubs, but the clubs are serving alcohol. They don't want underage kids running around in there. They think, what if these kids are trying to drink? The authorities are going to shut us down. So the solution that they propose, okay, well, we don't want to drink anyway. Just to make it clear, why don't you just mark a big X on the back of our hands so that, you can instantly see who the underage kids are. The bar staff will know not to serve us, and that's fine. We don't mind. We'll happily wear this X to show that we're not drinking. And that becomes the emblematic thing of straight edge. So even if they're not in a place where this is the rule, these kids start wearing the X's on the back of their hands to show that, we're not interested in that stuff. And when eventually the Teen Idols release their first EP, that's the cover of the record, and that becomes one of the defining proto-straight edge images. Alec Mackay's crossed fists with the X's on. So the vast majority of these young DC bands do kind of share this outlook. They're not militantly telling people, oh, you can't drink, you can't do drugs, but it's more just a mindset that we don't need that. That's for the older guys. And you hear that in the Teen Idols music, you hear it in the Untouchables, whose great anti-smoking anthem Nick Fit was later on covered by Sonic Youth on the Dirty album. But yeah, most of the bands in that scene have at least sort of one or two songs that touch on this. SOA have got it, Youth Brigade, Government Issue. But then obviously Minor Threat really kind of crystallise it with that song Straight Edge. And a few other others too, Out of Step particularly with its I don't smoke, don't drink, don't fuck, at least I can fucking think lines, which come to be used as a bit of a set of rules against Ian Mackay's wishes by future generations of straight edgers. So as these records get out, as these bands get out and play in a few more places, more people start picking up on this lifestyle, and it becomes a bit more codified into what people tend to think of as straight edge, as a sort of defined movement. And you get straight edge scenes cropping up in other areas of the States, over on the West Coast with bands like Uniform Choice, and in other areas on the East Coast too, Boston and New York. There are straight edge scenes growing up there too. Still plenty of people who are involved in straight edge now, and there've been tons of good bands since, thriving scenes all over the world, and a bit more of a variety of music, with some bands still harking back to that original DC sound, and then others mixing in more elements of metalcore or street punk or whatever else they fancy, really. It's not something I've massively kept up with. I don't drink or take drugs anymore either, but I've never identified myself as straight edge. But there's definitely still a ton of bands producing good music, and if it's something that gives people a sense of purpose and encourages people to live a healthy or positive life, then I can't see that that's a bad thing. So that brings me to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in this alternative universe, things are basically the same as ours, except that Cypress Hill are all 6 years younger, and so they've come together as a band right around 1982, which is about when straight edge starts to spread over to the West Coast. They've heard the early Minor Threat and SOA records, and they're really inspired by that. Be Real, who's the lead singer of this punk band version of Cypress Hill, is especially inspired by Government Issue. John Stabb from Government Issue had this quite sarcastic toned, whiny voice, and these lyrics that are really quite sardonic. So they start the straight edge band. They've got these short, aggressive songs railing against drugs and alcohol, and particularly against cannabis, because that's the thing that so many of their peer group are really into, and they're totally against that. So they really want to make sure that message comes across clearly. They've managed to strike a deal with Discord Records over in DC to get them to co-release an EP that they've put together. And the first song on this EP is I Want to Get High, which is a deeply sarcastic song in which Be Real plays the part of a dedicated stoner, mocking the attitudes of people who do smoke cannabis. Unfortunately, a lot of their peer group who are stoners hear this song and completely miss the sarcasm and assume that he's being very sincere. So unwittingly, they've created a stoner anthem. All these stoners start turning up at their gigs, which is a massive cause of frustration to this band, who are very, very serious about being straight edge. So in despair, they reluctantly break up, and that's the end of straight edge Cypress Hill. But the record goes on to become a massively sought after collector's item, and I Want to Get High does finally become a straight edge anthem to new generations of straight edgers who finally actually get the irony that was intended. So It was an interesting process trying to turn I Want to Get High into a straight edge hardcore song. If you know the original track, it's not really a fully formed song, it's just got the I Want to Get High refrain at the start and the end, and then just one verse. So to turn it into a more traditional punk song format, I had to actually chop the song up to create separate verses and choruses. So dropped the vocal into GarageBand and synced it up to the grid first, and then I just found some good edit points in Be Real's rap to create 3 separate verses, and then the refrain at the start and the end, I just picked a couple of phrases of that and layered different bits of the I Want to Get High chorus over each other, so it's that vocal's doubled up. I then sped it up massively because the original goes at this super laid back, blunted kind of stoner pace, and we wanted none of that. We wanted heads down, charging hardcore, so sped it right up. I programmed some drums on next, just going for pretty straight ahead kind of hardcore punk stuff. I thought for the verses it'd be cool to do a thing where we have stabs of chords and then a drum fill at the end of each line, because that's a thing I've heard in a few old hardcore songs now that I really liked it. And then I just mix it up a little bit, so we've got one verse that goes just onto the floor tom instead of the hi-hat cymbal, and one chorus that drops down to half time as well, just so that there's plenty of variety in there. Added some bass next, nothing at all fancy, just basically doubling what the guitar's doing an octave down with a nice growly, gnarly lo-fi tone. Guitar-wise, there's 3 guitars on there, mainly just 2 rhythm guitars, panned left and right. The riff that I used as the main riff of the song is based on the notes of the double bass riff that's sampled for the original record, because I thought it'd be good to try and make sure that there was some musical continuity there with the original record. Nothing fancy again, power chords, overdriven valve amp, maybe a little overdrive pedal as well, just to tighten everything up, and off you go. And then there's just a 3rd guitar comes in playing some screeching lead over the outro as well, just to add an extra little bit to build towards the end there. And there wasn't much else to do. The only other thing I did was add just a few more backing vocals to bolster those choruses, get a bit of a kind of gang vocal feel going in the background to really kind of toughen up those choruses and make them sound a bit more anthemic. So high. And then for the video, started out as ever by just finding a bit of live performance footage, which I synced up to the track, and then I blended that in with some live footage of, I just went back to the OG straight edge band Minor Threat, because some great footage. It looks like shot from on stage. Brian Baker and Lyle Preslar and Steve Hankson all playing there, and the crowd just spilling all over the stage as well. So I thought that was really good footage, so I mixed that in. And then, as usual, just mocked up a few concert posters from that early to mid 80s straight edge scene to just pop Cypress Hill in there and put them in that correct kind of historical context as well. So, hope you enjoyed this one. It's a short but sweet track, and I always love doing the punky ones. I did my best to make it sound like the era I was aiming for. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe. That's always greatly appreciated. If there's anything else you'd like me to try in coming months, I always welcome your suggestions, so any songs that you'd like me to have a go at, any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, or any artists you'd like me to take a look at, drop a mention down in the comments as well, and I'll put them on the list. Can't promise at all that I'll get around to everything, but it's always nice to have those suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will see you next time.